Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 30th of July. Today we're focusing most of our attention on one part of the front line just north of Novomikhailivka. A lot of the recent energy has shifted in this direction. We have a lot of videos to go through, and in the end I'll also look briefly at Oruzhenia. But let's begin by zooming in and talking about this part of the front line that I've started mentioning more recently, but generally has not been on the radar of most people keeping track of frontline changes. But all of the topography has been pointing in a certain direction where the Russian forces did have an opportunity to take advantage of the dynamics essentially on the ground and actually begin advances. And so now we're seeing some of that begin to manifest. And so the Russian forces, we know that it's been about half a year now since they captured Pobieda. It's been a really long time since they solidified control over this region. And the main Russian unit that is pushing through with assault operations over here is the 255th Motor Rifle Regiment. And so they're really involved not just in those armored assaults and then landings, but also artillery operations towards Ukrainian targets in the region. And so they're the main unit that's conducting the sort of day-to-day operations here. But in any case, the Russian forces already had this sort of linchpin that is along the 0532 road leading into Kostyantynivka and then further south into Vuhledar. And so that was a really important gain for them. And also over the past few months, following the fall of Novomikhailivka, the Russian forces have been able to secure the Zhiverinets fortification system and various other trenches and generally heights that are located north of said village. And now that the Russians, for a couple of months now, solidified control in this region, they've turned it into their own strongholds and are using these same fields that are located on higher elevation as a conduit to continue to advance westwards. And their hope, based on the movement that we're seeing, is to conduct a two-pronged attack. One attack coming from the Pobieda region and then going in this sort of southwestern direction. And then another one coming in from this eastern direction to try to link up just north of Kostyantynivka in order to overrun the Ukrainian defensive line that was built west of the road, and then in order to create a very strong northern flank that could help in just completely decimating a protracted Ukrainian resistance, because we're going to get into that with some new footage coming out of Kostyantynivka. But before that, let's look at Pobieda, because really we haven't seen Russian vehicular operations here in a while. We've seen some back and forth fighting near the village of Pobieda, and the situation really did begin to stabilize with the movement of the 33rd Mechanized Brigade from the Zaporozhye region to this part of the front line in the early stages of 2024. And since then, they have sent in leopards to try to engage the Russian side. For the most part, it has been relatively static, bar a few recent Russian advances that have occurred just north of Pobieda, which are also really important. But let's zoom in now and look at the actual advance. The Russian forces, starting July 29th, were able to capture about 1.4 square kilometers of land, advancing in the southwestern direction. If we're measuring it, about 1.7 kilometers. So it is an important advance when you look at it. Here's the actual initial footage, and I should say July 29th, not 30th. And this was released in conjunction between the 33rd Brigade and the 207th Territorial Defense Battalion, which is somewhere over here. I want to see if I have them marked. Yeah, I do. And they're part of the 241st TDF Brigade, which is very interesting because that same unit also has a presence in Bakhmut. And so its units are split with at least one battalion over here. And they jointly conducted this effort to target the Russian vehicles here, which in total there were 8 vehicles, and each one had some sort of capacity where there were troops inside a squad that was supposed to dismount and then take over tree lines. And so what's being claimed by this post by the Ukrainian side and also by the footage they showed is that they were able to damage 2 Russian BMPs, 3 APCs, 1 motorcycle, which again, a lot of these armored assaults are now getting accompanied by a motorcycle at the vanguard, at the helm of the assault, and then 1 BMP was destroyed in total out of those 8 vehicles. And you can see the compilation utilizing, of course, artillery, sometimes landmines in this region, although they're more pronounced further south. And of course, a lot of it is coming from FPV drones. And so the Russian advance, it is occurring directly along the highway because that's where you could have a lot of these vehicles advancing through in a sort of concise fashion and in a paved road, of course. And then you had some of the vehicles by the 30th branch off in a second day of assaults, this time only utilizing 5 vehicles. The Russian forces were able to advance, let's see how much. They were able to advance 700 meters westwards, land in this particular tree line, and now they're fighting with the Ukrainians to solidify control over the sort of western flank, which would give them more support and balance for their salient that they've created by advancing along the road. And so in this video, it's just various FPV strikes onto the Russian column heading towards the tree line. There may also be some artillery fire directed. I believe that the grads, there was some grad rocket fire directed by the Ukrainians towards the Russian columns as they were advancing through those fields. And so, yeah, artillery was active in trying to repel those assaults. There is a pretty strong Ukrainian artillery component that is present not just here, but also further south around Kostyantynivka. And a lot of the time they're utilizing 155 millimeter DPICM shells, but in this case, the Ukrainians were using the 122 millimeter shells. Now, zooming in, there's also this footage from the 30th from the 255th, I think it's regiment, we said, which the Russians are, again, operating with in this theater. And they were able to destroy a Ukrainian Leopard 2A4 that was operating here, trying to repel the Russian armored assaults. That's the goal of having the Leopards here, try to contain any Russian advances along that sort of highway. But this time it was spotted near the tree line as it was firing towards Russian forces. The FPV hit the turrets, and then a fire started spreading to the armor, and eventually it just exploded and was destroyed in the process. And so that's the 6th loss of a Leopard in this general theater around Novomikhailivka in 2024. So it's not an insane amount, but you can see that in proportion to other parts of the front line, there are way more here, and that's due to the unit that's operating here, because the 33rd Brigade was created as a sort of NATO unit, given a lot of the highest tier NATO Western weaponry over a year ago now, and they're still retaining a lot of it and are receiving some of the commitments over time, and those are the ones that are being utilized in the fighting here. So we know that these vectors that the Russians are capitalizing on are on a higher elevation. So for instance, the region just south of Pobieda, that's on a ridge, and this ridge is so important because as you can see, as we go westwards, it does expand, and you could see that most of it is under Ukrainian control at the moment within these two parallel lines, but it does directly overlook the chain of villages starting in Kostyantynivka that I've talked about for so long. And then if we go westwards, sort of connects together at Uspanivka and then goes northwards towards Kurakove. Or if you want to go westwards, then it connects to Andriivka, which is now a really important Ukrainian rear city that nobody's really discussing because it is still out of the Overton window, you could say, of discussion. But then again, the Russians being able to capitalize in this ridge over here would expose the northern flank of all of these villages on a river valley, and also all the trenches that were built just to the north of them, because the idea, the perception by the Ukrainians when they built it was that there would be a sort of vertical Russian attack coming from these fields to the south. But now you can see that a lot of it is coming from this eastern direction, and there aren't as many defensive lines prepared for that sort of case. But regardless of the amount of structures built, it doesn't change the fact that there is still a very strong Ukrainian defensive component from the 79th Air Assault Brigade, which I would wager is one of Ukraine's best units and best performing throughout the entirety of the war, given the amount of time they've been at the front line consistently, not taking breaks, and have been to various parts of the front line during that time period. In every single place they've been, they've succeeded in holding back Russians for weeks, if not months, in very particular areas over days upon days of the same volume of assaults. And yeah, again, but now they're very well versed in doing that. And so here, this is a video from July 30th. They're claiming here that the Russian forces launched another assault, because there was a claim that the Russians launched a 57 vehicle assault, but not in the area north of Novomikhailivka, but in the area, if we go a bit south, then coming from the southeastern side, coming from, for instance, Slavnia, and then advancing along the fields towards the area south of Kostyantynivka. That's what the 79th Brigade alleged, that there was a Russian attempt a couple of days ago to conduct this massive vehicular assault with 57 vehicles and like 9 motorcycles. and they claim to have repelled it. They showed a lot of footage indicating that they were able to push back columns, but I don't know if that 57 number is correct. Now they're repeating it again. What they're claiming is that the Russian forces organized in the early morning of the 30th was an assault containing, you know, 47 BMPs, MTLBs, any sort of armored fighting vehicle that could carry infantry in it and then dismount it. That's 47. Then another 10 tanks that were supposed to, of course, act as fire support to break through the initial Ukrainian line of defense in a lot of these tree lines over here. And then 10 motorcycles, because you do want to have the sort of high mobility infantry that reach the tree lines first, are able to begin with the initial firefights to pin down Ukrainians, and then the larger component from the mechanized or armored forces comes in, and then you have the tanks firing as well. And so it was highly coordinated based on what the 79th is alleging. And there was also at least one of the Max Pros utilized. Again, another sort of mobility option. And when you're looking at such a volume, that it's clearly not to just take over one specific tree line. It's clearly an attempt to just completely undermine the salient that you see that is formed here, because the Russians overlook the sort of Ukrainian salient northeast of Kostyantynivka, both from this eastern direction and from the north. And so they really want to close down on that position and reach the highway and actually create a very strong flank north of Kostyantynivka. That is the goal of such a major assault. Again, I can't verify if the assault actually did include that many vehicles, because we can never see that many in the drone shots. And also, they're claiming that this happened over the course of a day. So don't imagine in your head that it was just a long line of 57 vehicles advancing together in sync through various fields. That's not what happened. What they're claiming, at least, is that throughout the day, more and more poured in. And again, there was a variance. Some were abandoned, some were rotated in and out. But nonetheless, it is still a massive assault, and it indicates that the Russians have increased the amount of vehicular usage of all types, even the new equipment, using new types of BMPs or some of the staples of Russian tanks. So it's not like they're going back to older equipment from their armories and reserves to sort of fill holes with any sort of lack of vehicles. So they don't really have a deficit, at least in this part of the front line. In fact, they're able to just consistently over weeks, increase the intensity of assaults with vehicles, but that doesn't change the fact that a lot of them were lost in this operation, even based on the footage posted by the 79th, let alone the claims that were made by them. So the 79th, they claimed that during these Russian assaults that occurred basically horizontally along these fields here, that they were able to hit, not destroy, but hit 12 armored fighting vehicles, 8 tanks, 9 motorcycles, and the 1 buggy. And so I can believe the motorcycles, most of them end up getting destroyed. And a lot of them, it's just the Russian troop that was using them dismounted and then never looks back, and then it gets destroyed by an FPV. And then in terms of armored fighting vehicles, of course, when you're going in an area that's very volatile in the line of contact, a gray zone, and you're stuck in a certain area waiting for troops to dismount, it does make you way more susceptible to risk. And so it's very realistic, these numbers. If the number of vehicles in total was 57, I'm saying. If it's not, then I'm not exactly sure. But there are still a lot of pieces of footage indicating that there were mines laid over here all around this area, that there was artillery utilized, like we said before, from the Pobeda region, that, again, you had FPVs in the skies, really, really active. And so definitely there were losses. And now they didn't actually say which ones were destroyed. They just said hit. But they do claim that the Russian forces lost a total of 68 men, that 36 were killed and 32 were wounded. Now, if we're going to take those numbers at face value, then just doing percentages, we could assume that there were around 350 Russian soldiers operating in these vehicles and in these assaults throughout the day. Because if we're talking about 47 armored fighting vehicles, all of them having squads inside, those could vary from maybe 3 if you're looking at an older BMP, for instance. But, like in a BMP-3, I think that 7 troops could go in and dismount, actually. In an MTLB, it could be upwards of 11 that are within the same vehicle. And so if we're being very generous, then it will only, let's say we only say 6. And then we say 6 and we multiply that by the 47. And we also look at the amount of troops that are within the tanks or that are riding on motorcycles and a buggy. You combine it together and a lower ball estimate will be 350. It could be even higher than that. And that's an entire battalion size. So had an entire battalion force organizing in this one rather narrow region and continuing with the push here. That's a really massive advance. And the fact that we didn't see geolocations of the Russians pushing the mantle westwards in this initial footage published, either it means that it was completely repelled or that, maybe we'll see something in the coming days. But nonetheless, that is a really important defensive work by the 79th Brigade in order to sort of prevent the overwhelming of the front line in an area that is so saturated with Russian vehicles and forces. And so, based on those numbers that I told you about, the amount that are probably operating here and the amount that the Ukrainians claim were killed, it would only be around 10% of the entire fighting force that was killed and only about 20% that were taken as casualties in general. And so, given the fact that there were so many vehicles, and that based on the Ukrainian side, only 40% or over 40% were actually hit, so at least damaged, that will mean that a large amount of the Russian forces that were within those vehicles that got damaged, they were able to get out and survive eventually. Okay, now moving on further south, there are still really intense Russian operations south of Kostyantynivka. And I do have to say that this entire theater is the one with by far the most amount of vehicles being used. And so it's just by proxy going to be the one where you see the most destruction, because I haven't seen anything like this in the fighting that's occurred around Prokhrez or Novosivka Persha, Chasiv Yar even, because a lot of the fighting there is just from village to village. But here there are these massive fields that need to be crossed through, and a lot of them are well defended. And so then inevitably you have to sacrifice some vehicles. Here you could see a Russian advance. Let's actually measure the extent of it using the ruler over here. The Russian forces were able to advance around 700 meters northwards, and they finally been able to establish a foothold, albeit a very small one, within some of the ruins of the southeastern corner of the village. And we know this based on a video from the 29th of July, where this is footage of Ukrainian drones dropping grenades onto Russian soldiers, both within houses but also nearby. Because in a lot of cases, when a vehicle gets abandoned, then you have the troops sort of just split off into their own interests, just trying to survive within a tree line or crawling within a field. And so there's also footage of those troops that are spotted by drones getting targeted. And that's in an area just south of Kostyantynivka. The ones that actually made it into the village, they're the ones hiding in the ruins, and they're the ones getting targeted by the Ukrainian grenades. But this is a shift, because for really about a month and a half now, you've had Russian attempts to enter, and now they've finally been able to do that after pushing from multiple axes, and now having a sort of strong salient located directly south of Kostyantynivka, which will broaden the amount of the perimeter that the Ukrainians have to look over. And I believe that actually within the same compilation, the Ukrainians showed the destruction of at least one Russian BTR and one MTLB. And so just as a final recap, as we're looking at this region that the Ukrainians control northeast of Kostyantynivka is on a rather low elevation, along with the trenches to the west and along with the road. And so despite the fact that they have been able to hold the line over here and repel a lot of, but not all of, the vehicular assaults, the ones that they did repel located east, the ones they failed to are located further north. This is where we actually did see some material Russian gains along the highway that are now helping the Russians approach Kostyantynivka. In terms of the actual makeup of the elevation here, the Ukrainians are going to be defending basically in an uphill battle, and that's going to make it difficult in the long run to retain positions over here where you don't have any settlements. It's just located in fields, located in tree lines, where you don't have a stable road to feed you. And so just keep that in mind as we go forward. Just last thing I want to talk about very briefly is that the Ukrainians in the Belgorod region, they released footage of what is claimed to be what's referred to as the Bullseye 4 system, which is actually this North Korean system. Is supposed to be using the hull of an armored vehicle, and then on top there's mounted this entire rocket launching system. And so what you have are these 8 launchers of ATGMs with the range of about 10 kilometers for each one. And so now that's been spotted within the Belgorod region. For the first time, we've seen one actually being present. It was provided presumably by the North Koreans to the Russians. And this is after, for now, months, over half a year of the North Koreans shipping the Russians millions of artillery shells and dozens of short-range ballistic missiles. Now, for the first time, we're actually seeing them send in these vehicles, and they are pretty interesting because they're actually non-line of sight in terms of the nature of the ATGMs. And so when they get launched from the launcher, they don't actually have to be locked in on the targets. So it's very similar to like the Israeli Spike ATGM, for instance. And so it could change its course mid-flight and change targets as it's being launched. It could also evade various obstacles, man-made obstacles, geographical obstacles, which again increases its effectiveness. And also it does have a top-down trajectory when hitting targets. And so if it's hitting a tank, for instance, or really any sort of system, even artillery systems, which it may have already, it may have hit a AS-90 155 millimeter howitzer in the past. But in any case, if it's hitting the turret, then it does have much more success in terms of just completely destroying the vehicle, as opposed to hitting it from the sides and then perhaps causing some damage but not totally destroying it. And so we're going to have to keep an eye out for how it's utilized on the battlefield and if the Ukrainians try to target it. And that's all I have for today. So thank you for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.